In the sprawling mansion overlooking Sydney Harbour, a humble housekeeper made a promise that no one believed she could keep. But when the boy took his first steps, something happened that brought the powerful man to his knees in tears. Secrets buried for years suddenly came to light, and their lives changed forever in ways no one could have imagined. This is a story of hope, resilience, and true connection. Get ready because it will touch your heart in ways you never expected. The morning light spilled across the polished marble floors of the Hamilton estate, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny constellations. Claire Bennett paused at the threshold of the grand foyer, clutching her modest handbag against her chest. At 42, with her practical short-cropped, auburn hair and well-worn sensible shoes, she looked distinctly out of place in this palace of opulence. "You're the 5th this month," said Mrs. Winters, the stern household manager, her Australian accent clipped and efficient as she led Claire through the mansion. "Mr. Hamilton has high standards. The previous housekeepers didn't last more than a fortnight each." Claire nodded, taking in the hue, soaring ceilings, the artwork that probably cost more than she would earn in several lifetimes, and the unmistakable stillness that seemed to permeate every corner. This wasn't just wealth. It was wealth, wrapped in silence. "The boy's room is upstairs. You'll be responsible for keeping it tidy, bringing his meals and assisting with his basic needs," Mrs. Winters continued, not bothering to look. Back at Claire. "Mr. Hamilton has strict rules about interaction with Master Caleb. You're to do your job efficiently and with minimal conversation." They ascended a sweeping staircase, the kind Claire had only seen in films. "What about his physical therapy?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Winters paused, turning to face her with a raised eyebrow. "There are specialists who come 3 times a week. Your job is housekeeping, Miss Bennett, not medical care." Before Claire could respond, a door at the end of the hallway opened, and Alexander Hamilton emerged. Even in casual attire, a simple button-down shirt and tailored trousers, he carried himself with the unmistakable air of a man accustomed to power. His face, though handsome with its strong jawline and piercing blue eyes, seemed permanently etched with tension. "Mrs. Winters," he acknowledged with a curt nod before his gaze settled on Claire. "The new housekeeper." "Yes, sir. Claire Bennett, as I mentioned earlier." Alexander assessed Claire with a quick, clinical glance. "You have experience with children?" 20 years as a pediatric rehabilitation specialist before I moved to Australia, sir," Claire replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Something flickered across Alexander's face, surprise perhaps, or skepticism. "And you're applying for a housekeeping position?" Claire maintained her composure. "Life takes unexpected turns, Mr. Hamilton. I'm here because I need the work, and because I believe I can be of service." He seemed to consider this for a moment before continuing. "My son requires consistency and calm, whatever your qualifications. I expect you to follow the household protocols to the letter. Caleb's condition makes him sensitive to disruption." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Caleb hasn't walked since he was 4 years old. The doctors have their theories, but none can explain why a perfectly healthy boy suddenly stopped walking after—" He caught himself, jaw tightening. "His care instructions are detailed and non-negotiable." Claire nodded, recognizing the pain beneath his business-like demeanor. "I'll follow them carefully." Alexander turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Miss Bennett. Don't make promises you can't keep. Caleb has had enough disappointment." As he disappeared down the hallway, Mrs. Winters gave Claire a meaningful look. "That's the most he's said to any new staff member in months. Consider yourself warned." The rest of the orientation passed in a blur of instructions and rules. When finally left alone to unpack in her quarters, a modest but comfortable room in the staff wing, Claire sat on the edge of the bed, processing the weight of the atmosphere in this beautiful, hollow house. Later that afternoon, she was introduced to Caleb. The boy sat in his wheelchair by the window of a room that could have belonged in a design magazine, perfect in every detail, but utterly devoid of the chaos that usually accompanied a 9-year-old's space. No scattered toys, no fingerprints on the glass, nothing out of place. "Hello, Caleb," she said gently. "I'm Claire." The boy regarded her with solemn eyes that seemed too old for his young face. He had his father's features, the same strong jawline in miniature, the same blue eyes, but where Alexander's gaze was sharp and assessing, Caleb's was distant, as if he were looking at the world from behind a wall of glass. "You won't stay," he said simply, his voice soft but clear, the Australian accent lighter than his father's. None of them do. The matter-of-fact way he said it, without a hint of self-pity, made Claire's heart ache. "Well," she replied, setting down the fresh linens she'd brought, "I suppose we'll have to see about that, won't we?" A flicker of curiosity crossed his face before he turned back to the window, conversation clearly over. That evening, as Claire went about her duties, she observed the rhythms of the household. Alexander returned late, disappearing into his study with barely a word to anyone. The staff moved efficiently through their tasks, speaking in hushed tones. And somewhere above, Caleb sat alone in his room, a small figure in a vast, empty space. In her previous life, Claire had worked with children who faced seemingly insurmountable physical challenges. She had witnessed the miracle of first steps after devastating accidents, of words spoken after doctors had pronounced them impossible, but she had never encountered a silence like the one that enveloped the Hamilton mansion, a silence that seemed to have its roots in something deeper than Caleb's inability to walk. As she prepared for bed, Claire looked out her window at the Sydney harbour lights twinkling in the distance. The beauty of her adopted country still took her breath away even after 5 years. She had come to Australia seeking a fresh start after her own life had unravelled, but instead found herself adrift, taking jobs that barely utilised her skills, moving from place to place. Perhaps that was why she felt a strange connection to the boy who couldn't walk and the father who couldn't seem to reach him. They were all, in their own ways, stranded in beautiful surroundings, unable to move forward. "One day at a time," she whispered to herself, an old mantra from her days working with patients. It had been her guiding principle then, and it would serve her now. She didn't know yet what kept Caleb bound to his wheelchair, or what kept Alexander bound to his pain, but Claire Bennett had always been good at finding paths where others saw only walls, and tomorrow she would take the first step. By her third day at the Hamilton estate, Claire had memorized the rigid schedule that governed Caleb's life. Breakfast at 7, tutors from 8 until noon, lunch followed by rest, physical therapy 3 times a week, dinner at 6 and bed by 8. Every moment accounted for, every activity supervised, all spontaneity carefully excised. It was during the afternoon rest period that Claire first broke the rules. Instead of simply delivering Caleb's lunch tray and leaving as instructed, she lingered, noticing how he picked at his food without interest. "Not hungry?" she asked, opening the curtains wider to let in more light. Caleb shrugged, his thin shoulders rising and falling beneath his designer shirt. "It's always the same." Claire glanced at the perfectly balanced, nutritionist-approved meal. "What would you prefer?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Dad says this is what I need to stay healthy." "Your father is probably right," Claire acknowledged, "but sometimes a little variety doesn't hurt." She picked up an apple from the tray, polishing it against her apron. "When I was your age, my grandmother would cut apples into boats with peanut butter sails." A flicker of interest crossed Caleb's face. "Really? Really? Would you like me to show you?" For a moment, she thought he might refuse, retreat back behind the wall of politeness that seemed to be his default. But then he nodded almost imperceptibly. 5 minutes later, Claire had transformed the austere meal into something that actually made Caleb's lips twitch upward. Not quite a smile, but close. As he tentatively bit into an apple boat, she casually asked, "Do you ever go outside to the garden?" Caleb shook his head. "Not often. Dad says it's better if I stay inside where it's safe." Claire glanced out the window at the magnificent grounds below, where jacaranda trees swayed in the gentle breeze, their purple blossoms creating a canopy that seemed made for a child's adventures. "That's a shame. It looks beautiful out there." "I used to go," Caleb said quietly, studying the half-eaten apple in his hand. Before you stopped walking?" He nodded, his eyes clouding with a memory. "Mum used to take me. We had picnics under the big tree." It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother, and Claire treaded carefully. "That sounds lovely. You must miss those times." "Dad doesn't like to talk about her, or about before." He set the apple down, suddenly less interested. "You should go. It's rest time." Claire recognized the withdrawal, the way he retreated when emotions became too complicated. She'd seen it countless times in her previous work. "All right," she said, standing. "But Caleb, the garden is still there. And so are picnics." The next day, during the hour when Alexander was known to be in meetings, and Mrs. Winters was handling the weekly staff payments, Claire made her second rebellion. She wheeled Caleb's chair onto the wide veranda that overlooked the garden, ignoring his protests. "We're breaking the rules," he said, though she noticed he didn't ask to go back inside. "Sometimes rules need bending," Claire replied, positioning his chair so the sun warmed his face without blinding him. "Feel that? That's vitamin D. Very good for growing bones." Caleb closed his eyes, tilting his face slightly upward. For the first time since she'd arrived, his perpetual frown eased. "It's warmer than I remembered. Would you like to go further? Down to the grass?" His eyes snapped open suddenly, wary. "I can't. The chair—" "I'm stronger than I look," Claire assured him, already navigating the ramp at the side of the veranda. "And I'm very good at pushing wheelchairs. It was part of my old job." "What old job?" Claire smiled as they reached the lawn, the wheels of his chair leaving tracks in the perfectly manicured grass. "I used to help children learn to walk again after they'd been hurt or sick." Caleb absorbed this information silently as Claire guided his chair beneath the shade of a massive jacaranda tree. Purple flowers carpeted the ground around them, creating a scene so picturesque it might have been painted. "Why did you stop?" he finally asked. Claire bent down to pick up a fallen blossom, twirling it between her fingers. "That's a story for another day. For now, wood. You like to take off your shoes, feel the grass between your toes." The suggestion clearly startled him. I don't know if I should." "It's just grass, Caleb. It won't bite." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. Claire knelt and gently removed his expensive leather shoes and socks. His feet were pale, the skin soft from lack of exposure to the elements. Carefully, she helped him place them on the cool grass. The change in his expression was immediate, a mixture of surprise and something close to delight as the blades tickled his soles. "It feels alive," he whispered. "That's because it is," Claire said, sitting beside him on the grass. "Everything out here is." They stayed like that for 20 minutes, neither speaking much, just existing in the peaceful garden, surrounded by the scent of flowers and the distant sound of waves from the harbor. When it was time to return, Claire noticed that Caleb sat straighter in his chair, his eyes more alert, as if the brief connection with the natural world had awakened something long dormant. What neither of them realized was that they had been observed. From the window of his home office, Alexander Hamilton had witnessed their small rebellion, his expression unreadable as he watched his son's face turn toward the sun for the first time in years. The discovery came on Claire's 9th day at the Hamilton estate. She had been tasked with reorganizing the rarely used East Wing storage rooms, a job she suspected was meant to keep her occupied and away from Caleb after Mrs. Winters had reported the unauthorized garden excursion. The attic space was filled with expensive furniture, draped in white sheets like elegant ghosts from another time. Claire worked methodically, cataloging items as instructed, until she came upon a slender case pushed far back against the wall. Unlike everything else in the immaculate house, this case was covered in a layer of dust so thick it suggested deliberate neglect rather than mere oversight. Curiosity piqued, Claire carefully opened it. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a violin, not a child's instrument, but a full-sized one with a rich amber finish that glowed even in the dim attic light. She ran her fingers gently over the strings, producing a soft, discordant hum that seemed to fill the empty space with memories. "What are you doing?" Claire turned to find Alexander, standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from the hallway. "I'm sorry," she said, carefully closing the case. "I was cataloging as instructed." Alexander crossed the room in a few long strides, his eyes fixed on the violin case. "That wasn't meant to be included in the inventory." "It's beautiful," Claire said, watching his face carefully. "Do you play?" Something flickered across his features. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "No," he replied curtly, then seemed to reconsider his tone. "It belonged to my wife. Catherine was a violinist with the Sydney Symphony before—" He trailed off, his hand resting protectively on the case. "Before Caleb was born," Claire ventured. "Before she left," Alexander corrected, his voice flat. "When Caleb was 4, the pieces began to fall into place. Around the time he stopped walking." Alexander's gaze snapped to her face, suddenly sharp. "Mrs. Winters mentioned you've been taking liberties with Caleb's schedule, the garden excursion, the modified meals." "I thought some fresh air and small changes might help his mood," Claire explained, standing her ground. "In my experience, children respond well to—" "You were not hired for your experience, Miss Bennett," Alexander interrupted. You were hired to maintain Caleb's environment as prescribed by his doctors. With all due respect, Mr. Hamilton, I've worked with many children in situations similar to Caleb's. Sometimes the prescribed environment isn't what they need most. And what do you think my son needs exactly? His tone was challenging, but Claire sensed genuine inquiry beneath the defensiveness. Connection, she answered simply, to the world outside his room, to his own capabilities, to— She hesitated, then continued gently, to memories that might be painful, but are still part of who he is. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and Claire thought she might have overstepped fatally. Then, to her surprise, he picked up the violin. Case, bring this downstairs when you finish here, he said, setting it down with unexpected care. Not to Caleb, to my study. The following afternoon, Claire was helping Caleb with a science assignment when she heard it. Faint but unmistakable. The sound of a violin, its notes hesitant and slightly out of tune but recognizable as a simple melody. Caleb's head lifted immediately, his eyes widening. That's— he began, then fell silent, listening intently. Do you recognize it? Claire asked softly. The boy nodded, his fingers gripping the arms of his wheelchair. Mum used to play it, for bedtime. Without asking permission, Claire wheeled him toward the source of the music. They found Alexander in the seldom-used music room, his back to the door, the violin held somewhat awkwardly under his chin as he attempted to coax a melody from it. Dad? Caleb's voice was barely audible. Alexander turned, surprise and something like embarrassment crossing his face as he lowered the instrument. Caleb, I was just— He cleared his throat. It needed tuning. You never play, Caleb said, a question in his words. Alexander glanced at Claire, who remained by the door, then back to his son. I don't play, not really. Your mother tried to teach me once, but I never had her talent. He ran his fingers along the violin's neck. I thought perhaps it was time to take it out again. Can I— Caleb hesitated. Can I touch it? Something complicated passed over Alexander's face. Reluctance, fear, and beneath it all, hope. After a moment's hesitation, he crossed the room and carefully placed the violin in his son's lap. Caleb's small fingers traced the curve of the wood with a reverence that made Claire's heart ache. This was the most animated she had seen him, his entire being focused on the instrument as if it were a living connection to the mother who had left him. She loved this more than anything, Alexander said quietly, watching his son. Then, meeting Caleb's eyes, he added, almost more than anything. Later that evening, after Caleb had been settled for the night, Claire found Alexander in his study, a glass of amber liquid untouched before him, the violin case open on his desk. He hasn't responded like that to anything in years, he said without looking up as she entered with the evening household report. Not to specialists, not to therapy, not to— He trailed off, then added softly, not to me. Music can reach places words can't, Claire offered, setting the report beside the case, especially when it carries memories. Catherine played for him every night from the day he was born, Alexander said, his voice distant with recollection. Even on tour, she'd call and play for him over the phone. Claire took a careful seat across from him. May I ask what happened? Between you and Caleb's mother? Alexander's gaze sharpened, then softened as he seemed to make a decision. It wasn't what you might think. There was no dramatic betrayal, no scandalous affair. He sighed deeply. There was an accident at the harbor. Catherine was playing with Caleb near the water when he fell in. She saved him, but the trauma— He stopped walking. Afterward, the doctors called it conversion disorder, a physical manifestation of psychological distress. And Catherine? She blamed herself, became convinced she was a danger to him. Alexander's voice grew quieter. I was focused on finding treatments, specialists, cures. I didn't see how deeply she was suffering until it was too late. One day, she was simply gone. A note saying Caleb would be better without her, safer. And you never told him? How do you tell a 4-year-old that his mother left because she thought she might hurt him again? Alexander's hands tightened around the glass. It seemed kinder to say nothing. But he remembers her, Claire pointed out gently. He remembers the music, the picnics. Children fill the silences we create with their own explanations, Mr. Hamilton. Sometimes those are more damaging than the truth. Alexander studied her with new intensity. You speak from experience. Claire nodded but offered no elaboration. This wasn't about her past. The violin reached him today. Perhaps there are other ways to help him reconnect, not just with his memories but with his body's capabilities. The specialists have tried everything, Alexander said, a familiar weariness creeping into his voice. With all respect, they've tried everything within a very controlled environment, Claire countered. Sometimes healing happens in unexpected settings, through unexpected means. Alexander was silent for a long moment, contemplating the violin. Finally, he looked up at her with cautious resolve. What do you suggest? The following week brought subtle changes to the Hamilton household. The rigid schedule loosened slightly to accommodate what Claire called exploration sessions, short periods where Caleb could choose an activity within certain parameters. Alexander, though still clearly uncomfortable with deviation from established routines, observed from a careful distance. Claire's first breakthrough came during a rainy afternoon when she brought a selection of art supplies to Caleb's room. Among the watercolors and sketch pads was a small container of clay. "I can't," Caleb said when she suggested he try sculpting. "My hands shake too much." "That's perfect for clay," Claire replied, placing a small piece in his palm. "It responds to every tremor, every hesitation. That's how it tells you what it wants to become." Skeptical, but curious, Caleb began to work the material between his fingers. His initial frustration gradually gave way to concentration as the clay warmed and became more pliable. By the end of the hour, he had created something that resembled a small boat, rough and lopsided, but unmistakably his own creation. "Can we save it?" he asked, uncharacteristic enthusiasm coloring his voice. "To show Dad?" Claire felt a surge of hope at the request. "Of course, we'll let it dry right here on your windowsill." Alexander's reaction that evening was carefully measured. Claire could see him struggling between his instinct to maintain emotional distance and his genuine pleasure at his son's accomplishment. He examined the clay boat with the seriousness one might afford a museum piece. "The proportions are quite good," he commented, turning it over in his hands. "You have a good eye, Caleb." It was a small compliment, stiffly delivered, but the effect on Caleb was immediate. He sat straighter in his wheelchair, his thin chest expanding with pride. The second breakthrough came 3 days later. During one of their now regular garden visits, Claire brought along the violin, with Alexander's reluctant permission. "I don't know how to play," Caleb protested when she placed it carefully in his lap. "You don't need to play it to feel it," Claire explained, guiding his hand to the body of the instrument. "Just hold it against you. Feel how the vibrations change when you move the bow across different strings." Caleb experimented tentatively, his face transforming with wonder as he produced sounds, not music yet, but something alive and responsive to his touch. From the veranda above, unseen by either of them, Alexander watched, his knuckles white against the railing. Later that night, Claire found a folder on her bed, medical records, evaluations, treatment plans spanning the 5 years since Caleb had stopped walking, a silent invitation to understand, to help. She stayed up until dawn reading, learning the clinical history of the boy whose emotional landscape she was just beginning to map. The records confirmed what Alexander had told her: conversion disorder following trauma, with no physiological cause for Caleb's inability to walk. What struck Claire most was the pattern of treatments, all excellent, all appropriate, all conducted in controlled clinical environments with an emphasis on measurable outcomes rather than emotional healing. The next morning, bleary-eyed but determined, Claire presented Alexander with a proposal. "I'd like to incorporate music into Caleb's physical therapy," she said, sliding a carefully written plan across his desk. "Not as a replacement for his current treatments, but as a complement." Alexander skimmed the document, his expression guarded. "You're suggesting we use Catherine's violin as, what, motivation?" "As a bridge," Claire corrected, "between Caleb's mind and his body, between his past and his present." She leaned forward. "Mr. Hamilton, conversion disorder isn't just about the mind or just about the body. It's about a disconnection between the two. Music can help rebuild that connection." Alexander was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that might have been intimidating if Claire hadn't recognized the hope beneath his scrutiny. "You genuinely believe this could help him walk again?" It wasn't a question, but Claire answered anyway. "I believe it could help him want to walk again. The rest might follow." After a pause that seemed to stretch between them like a held breath, Alexander nodded once. 2 weeks, he said. We'll try your approach for 2 weeks. If there's no improvement, we return to the established protocols. Claire accepted the terms with a gracious nod, hiding the surge of determination that rose within her. 2 weeks wasn't much time to undo years of emotional and physical patterns, but it was a start. What neither of them discussed was the unspoken question, hanging in the air between them. If Caleb began to heal his connection to his body, would he also begin to ask more questions about the mother whose music was helping him do so? The transformation began in small, almost imperceptible ways. During the first week of Claire's new approach, Caleb's physical therapist, a competent but uninspired young man named Dr. Jensen, reported no measurable improvement in Caleb's mobility or strength, but Claire observed other changes, the way Caleb's eyes tracked movement more actively, how his posture had begun to straighten when the violin was in the room, the increased dexterity in his fingers as they worked the clay, or attempted simple notes on the strings. On the 8th day, Claire introduced a new element to their sessions. She placed a small, digital recorder on the table beside Caleb's wheelchair. "What's that for?" he asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "I thought we might send a message to someone," Claire said casually, adjusting the violin in his lap. "Someone who might like to hear how you're progressing with her instrument." Caleb's hands stilled on the violin. "You mean my mother?" Claire nodded, watching his reaction carefully. "Your father mentioned she's living in Melbourne now." This was a carefully calculated risk. Alexander had reluctantly shared Catherine's current location during one of their evening discussions, though he'd been adamant that direct contact would be too disruptive for Caleb. Claire had proposed a middle ground, recorded messages that could be sent if and when both Caleb and Alexander felt ready. "Does she know about me, about this?" Caleb gestured to his wheelchair. "She knows you're safe and being cared for," Claire replied truthfully. "I imagine she'd be very proud to hear you playing her violin, even just a little." Caleb stared at the recorder for a long moment, conflicting emotions playing across his face. Finally, he shook his head. "Not yet. I'm not good enough yet." Claire accepted this with a nod, inwardly pleased. Not yet was different from no. It held promise, motivation, a goal. "Shall we practice then? So you'll be ready when you decide it's time?" That afternoon, Caleb applied himself to the simple finger exercises Claire had taught him with unprecedented focus. By the end of the session, sweat beaded on his forehead, but he had successfully played a 5-note sequence 3 times in succession. "Tomorrow," he said as Claire wheeled him back to his room, "can we try something harder?" Alexander noticed the change at dinner that evening. Traditionally, a silent affair with Caleb picking at his food, while his father made stilted attempts at conversation about schoolwork, the meal took on a different energy, as Caleb voluntarily described his progress with the violin. "Claire says my fingers are getting stronger," he reported, actually taking a bite of his salmon without prompting. "She thinks I might be able to learn a real song soon." Alexander's gaze flicked to Claire, who stood discreetly by the door, as was customary during meals. "That's excellent news," he said, clearly caught off guard by his son's enthusiasm. "Perhaps you could play for me when you're ready." "It was Mom's favorite," Caleb continued, his voice growing quieter. Claire found the sheet music in the case. "Meditation," from Tace. Alexander's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his composure slipping for just a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "She played it at our wedding." It was the most personal detail he had shared with Caleb in Claire's presence, and she noticed how the boy absorbed it like parched earth taking in rain, desperate for more but trying not to appear too eager. Later that night, after Caleb had been settled into bed, Claire found Alexander in the music room, the sheet music for Meditation spread before him on the piano bench. "I could feel you hovering in the doorway," he said without turning around. "You might as well come in." Claire entered, taking a seat on a nearby chair. "He's making progress, Mr. Hamilton." "Alexander," he corrected absently, his fingers tracing the notes on the page. "I think we're past formalities at this point, don't you?" Claire acknowledged this with a small smile. "Alexander, then. Caleb's responding to the music in ways that go beyond just physical therapy. It's giving him purpose, connection, and raising questions I'm not sure I'm ready to answer." Alexander looked up at her, his expression troubled. "This recorder idea, sending messages to Catherine, I'm not convinced it's wise. Sometimes the anticipation of contact can be as therapeutic as the contact itself." Claire explained. It gives him a reason to improve, to show her his progress. She paused, then added gently, and it gives you time to prepare for the possibility of reconnection. Alexander's laugh held no humor. Is that what you think I need? Preparation? I think, Claire said carefully, that healing isn't just for Caleb. The accident hurt all three of you. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss her, retreat behind the wall of employer-employee propriety. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, shoulders sagging with an exhale that seemed to release years of held tension. She blamed herself completely, he said quietly. I tried to tell her it was just an accident, that Caleb's condition was temporary, that we would get through it together. But Catherine, he shook his head, she couldn't forgive herself, and perhaps I didn't help by focusing so intensely on fixing him. You were both responding to trauma in your own ways, Claire observed. There's no perfect response to seeing your child in distress. Alexander looked at her with sudden intensity. You speak as if from experience, Claire. You've mentioned your work with children, but never your own life. Claire felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied questions about her past. My experience is professional, she said simply. Working with families in crisis teaches you a great deal about human response to trauma. Alexander studied her face, clearly sensing the deflection, but choosing not to pursue it. Catherine sent letters for the first year, he said instead. Then packages on his birthdays. He hesitated, guilt flashing across his features. I kept them, never gave them to him. I thought a clean break would be easier. And now I wonder if I was protecting him or myself. Alexander stood, carefully gathering the sheet music. I'll consider the recordings. But Claire, his voice took on a note of caution. Don't promise him something I can't deliver. If these messages are created, I need to be certain of their reception before they're sent. Claire nodded her, understanding, recognizing both the concession and the boundary. One step at a time, she agreed, just like his therapy. The following morning brought a breakthrough neither of them had anticipated. During their regular garden session, Claire had brought along not just the violin but a small portable speaker. She played a recording of Meditation, performed by the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, with Catherine Hamilton as the soloist. The effect on Caleb was immediate and profound. As the haunting melody filled the garden, his entire body seemed to respond, straightening, leaning forward, fingers moving unconsciously in sync with the flowing notes. She's playing, he whispered, eyes wide with wonder. That's really her. It is, Claire confirmed. From a concert 6 years ago. Your father kept the recording. When the piece ended, Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then, without warning or preamble, he placed his hands on the arms of his wheelchair and pushed himself upward, attempting to stand. Claire moved quickly to support him, but not quickly enough to prevent his legs from buckling. As she caught him, easing him back into the chair, she felt a mixture of concern and elation. I'm sorry, Caleb gasped, clearly frustrated by his body's betrayal. I thought I could— No apologies, Claire interrupted firmly. That was remarkable, Caleb. You wanted to stand, and you tried. That's the first step. But I failed, he protested, the momentary confidence deflating. You didn't fail, Claire corrected, kneeling to meet his eyes. You began. Alexander's reaction to Caleb's attempt to stand was complex, a mixture of cautious optimism, renewed determination, and thinly veiled fear. He immediately called Dr. Jensen for an emergency session and requested detailed reports on Caleb's physical condition. It's promising, the doctor explained after a thorough examination, but we shouldn't rush. His muscles have atrophied somewhat from disuse. We need to strengthen them systematically before attempting weight-bearing exercises. But there's no physical reason he can't walk, Alexander pressed, his intensity causing the younger man to shift uncomfortably. As I've always maintained, Mr. Hamilton, there never was a physical impediment, Dr. Jensen replied. The issue has been neurological, a disconnect between brain and body. If that's beginning to resolve, we need to support the process carefully. Claire, standing quietly near the door of Caleb's room during this discussion, noted how they spoke about him as if he weren't present, a habit she'd observed repeatedly among the specialists who cycled through the house. Caleb had learned to become nearly invisible during these consultations, his expression neutral, his body still. But today was different. Today she could see the restlessness in his hands, the way his eyes followed the conversation, alert and engaged. Whatever barrier had existed between his intention and his movement was thinning, becoming permeable. After Dr. Jensen left with promises of adjusted therapy protocols, Alexander lingered in Caleb's room, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Dad," Caleb ventured after a moment of awkward silence. "Are you angry?" Alexander looked startled. "Angry? Why would I be angry?" Caleb shrugged, picking at a loose thread on his blanket. "Because I tried to stand without permission, without the doctor." Something shifted in Alexander's expression. Realization, perhaps, or regret. He sat carefully on the edge of Caleb's bed, closer than Claire had ever seen. Him position himself. "Caleb," he said, his voice gentler than usual, "I have never ever been angry that you want to walk. I've only wanted you to be safe while you try. But the rules," Alexander interrupted, "were meant to protect you. Perhaps," he glanced briefly at Claire, "perhaps they've been too restrictive." In the days that followed, Claire observed a subtle shift in the household atmosphere. Alexander began joining them occasionally during their garden sessions, at first standing awkwardly on the periphery, then gradually participating in their conversations. During one session, he even brought out a photo album, something Claire had never seen in the meticulously curated public spaces of the house. "I thought you might like to see these," he said, placing it on high. The small table they'd set up beneath the jacaranda tree. "They're from before." Caleb's eyes widened as Alexander opened the album to reveal photographs of a younger, happier version of their family. There was Catherine, a slender woman with Caleb's same sensitive eyes and a cascade of dark hair, holding a violin on stage. There was Alexander without the perpetual tension in his shoulders, his arm around his wife's waist, and there was Caleb as a toddler, standing unassisted, laughing as he chased a ball across this very lawn. "I remember this," Caleb said softly, touching a photo of himself in a small sailboat, his mother beside him. "We were at the harbor." Alexander tensed visibly, but to his credit he didn't close the album or change the subject. "Yes," he confirmed, "your mother loved." "The water? That was the day, wasn't it?" Caleb asked, his voice small but steady. "The day I fell in." Claire held her breath, watching Alexander's face as he navigated this moment they'd both known would eventually come. He looked briefly at her, something like panic in his eyes before turning back to his son. "Yes," he said finally, "that was the day of the accident." "I remember the water." Caleb continued, still looking at the photograph. "It was cold, and then Mum was there pulling me out." He looked up at his father. "She saved me, but afterward, I couldn't walk anymore." Alexander swallowed hard. "The doctors called it conversion disorder. Your mind protected you from the trauma by affecting your body. And Mum left because of it," Caleb concluded, the statement hanging in the air between them. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. "She left because she blamed herself for the accident. Not because of you, Caleb. Never because of you. But she didn't say goodbye," Caleb said, a question in his words. Alexander's hand trembled slightly as he turned the page of the album, revealing more photos. "She thought it would be easier that way," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "She was wrong about that. We both made mistakes after the accident." It was the most honest conversation Claire had witnessed between them. Painful but necessary. The careful excavation of a wound that had never been properly cleaned. As they continued through the album, she quietly excused herself, giving them privacy for this long-overdue moment of reconnection. That evening, Alexander found her on the veranda, watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and crimson. "Thank you," he said simply, joining her at the railing, "for pushing us toward that conversation. It was overdue." Claire nodded, accepting his gratitude without false modesty. "He's stronger than you think, Alexander. Children often are." He asked about her letters, Alexander admitted, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I told him I'd get them for him tomorrow. That's a big step. One of many we need to take." He turned to face her then, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "I've spent 5 years trying to fix him, when perhaps what he needed was simply to be heard, to be allowed to remember even the painful parts." Claire smiled, recognizing the hard-won wisdom in his words. "Healing isn't linear," she said. "There will still be difficult days ahead. But we'll face them differently now," Alexander replied, and Claire didn't miss his use of "we," an acknowledgement that something had shifted between them, between all of them. A threshold had been crossed, and on the other side lay possibilities none of them had dared to imagine just weeks before. The box arrived from Alexander's study the following morning. A simple wooden container with a brass clasp, unadorned but clearly handcrafted with care. Inside were 17 letters, each in a pale blue envelope, and 5 small packages wrapped in silver paper, their corners softened with time but otherwise untouched. "They're all for you," Alexander said, placing the box on Caleb's bed. "1 letter every month for the first year, then 1 with each package on your birthday." Caleb stared at the collection, overwhelmed. "You had these all along?" Alexander nodded, his expression contrite. "I thought I was protecting you." "Can I—" Caleb began, then paused, looking uncertainly between his father and Claire, who stood quietly by the window. "Can I read them alone?" "Of course," Alexander replied, rising from the edge of the bed. "Take all the time you need." As they left the room, Claire noticed how Alexander's hand lingered on the doorframe, his reluctance to leave evident in the set of his shoulders. The man who had once been so determined to control every aspect of his son's environment was now forcing himself to step back, to allow Caleb the space to process his feelings without supervision or guidance. "This is the right thing," Claire assured him as they walked down the hallway together. "He needs to hear her voice, even if it's just on paper." "I know," Alexander conceded. "I just wish—" He trailed off, looking back toward the closed door. "That you could protect him from any more pain," Claire finished for him. Alexander's smile was rueful. "Am I that transparent?" "Only to someone who's watching closely," Claire replied, then felt a flush of warmth at the implication of her words. To cover the moment, she added, "He'll have questions afterward. About her, about what happened. Are you prepared for that?" "As prepared as I can be," Alexander sighed. "The truth is, I don't have all the answers he'll want. Catherine and we didn't part on terms that allowed for explanations." Claire considered this. Perhaps that's something that could change, now that Caleb is beginning to heal. Alexander gave her a sharp look. "You think I should contact her directly?" "I think," Claire said carefully, "that there are 3 people involved in this story, all carrying different pieces of the truth. Sooner or later, those pieces will need to come together." They paused at the entrance to Alexander's study, the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate the space that had once seemed so forbidding to Claire, but now felt merely thoughtful, reserved, like the man himself. "You've changed this household in just a few weeks," Alexander observed, studying her with a new intensity. "Caleb, me, the very atmosphere of the place. I've simply created space for what was already there waiting to emerge," Claire replied. "The love between you and Caleb, the possibility of healing, the courage to face difficult truths, those were never absent, just suspended." Alexander shook his head slightly, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You're being modest. Before you arrived, we were frozen in patterns that hadn't changed in 5 years. Now," he gestured vaguely toward Caleb's room, "now everything is in motion." Before Claire could respond, Mrs. Winters appeared at the end of the hallway, her expression pinched with disapproval. "Mr. Hamilton, you have a call from the Tokyo office. They say it's urgent." Alexander sighed, the businessman reasserting himself over the father, the man. "Tell them I'll be right there." To Claire, he added more quietly, "Stay close to Caleb this afternoon. He may need someone." The unspoken implication that Claire might understand Caleb's emotional needs better than he did hung between them as he turned toward his office. It was nearly 4 hours before Caleb emerged from his room, wheeling himself onto the veranda where Claire sat preparing materials for their afternoon session. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear, his expression thoughtful rather than devastated. "She didn't leave because she didn't love me," he said without preamble, a blue envelope clutched in his hand. "She left because she loved me too much to stay." Claire set aside her work, giving him her full attention. "That's what her letters told you?" Caleb nodded, looking down at the envelope. "She was afraid. After the accident, she couldn't stop seeing it happen over and over in her mind. She thought if she stayed, something worse might happen, because she couldn't trust herself anymore." He looked up at Claire, his eyes searching her face. "Is that what happens when you're afraid? You run away from the people you love?" The question pierced Claire with unexpected force, echoing her own history. In ways Caleb couldn't possibly understand, she chose her words carefully. "Sometimes people run away because they don't know how to face their fears. It doesn't mean they stop loving. It means they don't know how to love through the fear. She's in Melbourne, Caleb continued, unfolding the letter. She teaches music at a school there. And she said, his voice caught slightly, she said that whenever she plays her violin, she imagines I can hear it, wherever I am. That's beautiful, Claire said softly. I want to write back to her, Caleb declared, straightening in his chair with new determination. And I want to send a recording, not just of me playing, but of me talking, telling her I understand. Claire felt a surge of admiration for this boy, who at 9 years old was attempting to shoulder emotional complexities that would challenge most adults. I think that's a wonderful idea. Shall we work on it together? That afternoon, they composed a letter that was remarkable in its simplicity and forgiveness. Caleb dictated while Claire wrote, helping him find words for feelings too complex for his vocabulary, but never imposing her own interpretation on his experience. When Alexander returned from his business calls, he found them in the garden, the digital recorder set up beside the violin as Caleb practiced the opening notes of Méditation, still halting and imperfect, but recognizable. We're making a recording for Mom, Caleb explained, his earlier tears replaced by focused determination. Claire says I should play first, then talk. Do you think that's right? Alexander hesitated only briefly before joining them at the garden table. I think your mother would be honored no matter what order you choose, he said, his voice slightly rough. Would it be all right if I added something as well? The surprise on Caleb's face gave way to cautious hope. You want to talk to Mom too? I think it's time, Alexander replied, meeting Claire's eyes briefly over Caleb's head. There are things I should have said a long time ago. That evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day, Claire found Alexander in the music room once again. This time, instead of holding the violin, he was writing, page after page of careful script that he didn't attempt to hide when she entered. A letter to accompany Caleb's recording, he explained, setting down his pen. 5 years of unspoken words is a lot to condense. You don't have to send it, Claire pointed out, taking a seat nearby. The recording could be just from Caleb. Alexander shook his head. No, this is overdue. Catherine deserves to know how Caleb has been, how he is now, and she deserves— He paused, searching for the right words. She deserves to know that I no longer blame her for leaving, that I understand finally what she was trying to do. That's very generous, Claire observed. Not generous, necessary. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying Claire with a thoughtful expression. You know, you've never told me why you left your career in rehabilitation therapy, or why you came to Australia in the first place. Question, though gently posed, stirred the familiar unease that always accompanied discussions of her past. Claire looked away, toward the windows where night had transformed the glass into mirrors, reflecting the warm interior of the room. Some stories are harder to tell than others, she said finally. Alexander nodded, accepting this boundary. Fair enough. But Claire, whatever brought you here to this house, I'm grateful for it. The storm arrived without warning, sweeping in from the Pacific with a ferocity that belied the morning's clear skies. By mid-afternoon, rain lashed against the windows of the Hamilton estate. Wind bent the jacaranda trees nearly horizontal, and thunder rolled across the harbour like artillery fire. Claire found Caleb at his bedroom window, watching the tempest with fascination rather than fear. In the 3 days since he'd read his mother's letters, a new energy had infused him, as if reconnecting with that part of his past had awakened something long dormant. It's magnificent, isn't it? She said, joining him at the window. Caleb nodded, pressing his palm against the glass. Dad says there's a system moving up from Tasmania. They've closed the harbour. As if summoned by his mention, Alexander appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. The storms caused power outages across eastern Sydney, he reported. Our generator should kick in if we lose electricity, but the cellular networks are already becoming unreliable. Claire noticed how he directed this information to both of them, no longer treating her as merely staff to be instructed. Is there anything we should prepare? She asked. Mrs. Winters is handling the practical matters, Alexander replied, but I'm concerned about the package. The package had become their shorthand for the materials they planned to send to Catherine, Caleb's recording, Alexander's letter, and photographs Claire had taken of Caleb in the garden with the violin. They had planned to send it that day, but the courier service had cancelled all deliveries due to the weather. "It can wait another day," Claire assured them both. "The important thing is that it's ready." Caleb looked disappointed, but nodded his acceptance. The past few days had seen remarkable progress, not just in his emotional state, but physically as well. With Dr. Jensen's guidance and Claire's encouragement, he had begun exercises to strengthen his legs, and twice had managed to stand supported between parallel bars during his therapy session. "Perhaps we could use this time for a different kind of practice," Claire suggested, nodding toward the violin case resting on Caleb's desk. The storm provides quite a dramatic backdrop for music. As Caleb eagerly reached for the instrument, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then stabilized. Alexander's phone chimed with a message that drew his brows together in concern. "The coastal road is flooding," he said, checking the alert. "They're evacuating some of the lower areas near the harbor." Claire felt a flutter of anxiety. While the Hamilton estate sat high on a bluff, safe from flooding, the intensity of the storm was unusual even for Sydney's. Occasionally dramatic weather. "Should we be concerned?" she asked quietly. Alexander shook his head. "This house has weathered worse, but I should check the property, make sure everything's secure." He hesitated, then added, "Caleb, why don't you and Claire move to the main living room? It's more central if we lose power." As they relocated, Claire noticed how Alexander lingered in doorways, his gaze following his son with a new openness, pride mingled with something that might have been regret for the years of distance between them. The three of them had fallen into a rhythm over the past week that felt almost like family. Though Claire was careful not to romanticize her role, she was still an employee, still temporary, still holding parts of herself in careful reserve. The main living room, with its soaring ceiling and wall of windows overlooking the now tempestuous harbor, felt both grand and strangely intimate as the storm darkened the afternoon sky to twilight. Caleb positioned his wheelchair near the baby grand piano that dominated one corner, while Claire lit several battery-operated lanterns Mrs. Winters had distributed throughout the house. "Do you play?" Caleb asked, nodding toward the piano. Claire smiled, running her fingers lightly over the polished lid. "A little. My grandmother taught me when I was about your age." "Would you?" Caleb gestured to the bench. "While I practice. Mum used to have an accompanist when she performed. How could she refuse such a request?" Claire settled onto the bench, testing the keys with a few experimental chords. The instrument was perfectly tuned, its tone rich and resonant. "What shall we play?" For the next hour, as the storm raged outside, music filled the Hamilton home, halting at first as Claire and Caleb found their way together through simple melodies, then with growing confidence. Alexander moved between the living room and his study, ostensibly monitoring weather reports, but increasingly drawn to remain, watching his son's focused determination with undisguised wonder. They were working through a simplified version of meditation, Claire providing gentle harmonic support for Caleb's careful bow strokes, when a tremendous crash shook the house. The lights went out immediately, plunging the room into grey dimness broken only by the battery lanterns and sporadic flashes of lightning. "It's all right," Alexander said quickly, moving to Caleb's side. "Just a tree down from the sound of it. The generator should start any moment." But the backup power didn't engage. After several minutes of waiting in semi-darkness, Alexander disappeared to investigate, returning with a grim expression. "The generator's been damaged, likely by whatever fell. Mrs. Winters is calling the emergency service, but with the storm it could be hours." "We'll be fine," Claire assured them both, lighting additional lanterns. "We have light, the house is secure, and—" She broke off as Caleb suddenly set down his violin and wheeled himself toward the hallway. "Caleb, where are you going?" "The package," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's in my room. What if the rain gets in?" "I closed your windows," Alexander replied. "Everything will be fine until morning." But Caleb shook his head, already moving down the hallway. "The desk is right under the window. If the wind broke it—" "Caleb, wait," Claire called, following him. "Let me check for you." He either didn't hear or chose to ignore her, navigating his wheelchair with determined speed through the darkened house. Alexander and Claire exchanged concerned glances before hurrying after him. They caught up as Caleb reached the grand staircase that led to the upper floor and his bedroom. He stared up the imposing flight, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I'll go," Alexander offered, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Just tell me where exactly." "No!" Caleb's voice was sharp with an emotion Claire couldn't immediately identify. "I need to do it myself." And before either adult could react, he grasped the handrail and pulled himself upright, out of the wheelchair. Claire moved instinctively to support him, but Alexander caught her arm, holding her back with a slight shake of his head. Together they watched as Caleb stood unsteadily, his knuckles white against the railing, his legs trembling with the effort of supporting weight they hadn't borne in 5 years. "Caleb," Alexander said softly, "you don't have to prove anything. Not to me, not to your mother, not to yourself." Caleb turned to look at them, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning, determination mingled with fear, but also something Claire recognized from countless therapy sessions with other children, the moment when desire finally overcame limitation. "I know," he replied, his voice steadier than his legs, "but I want to." And with that, still holding the railing, he took one shaking step up the staircase. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. Caleb's foot, as it lifted, trembled and found purchase on the first step. Claire and Alexander stood frozen, barely breathing, as he shifted his weight forward. His face contorted with effort, but there was also a fierce joy in his expression, the exhilaration of reconnecting with his own body's capabilities after years of disconnection. "That's it," Alexander whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "You've got it, son." Caleb paused, gathering strength for the next step. His knuckles were white against the handrail, but his determination never wavered. With excruciating slowness, he lifted his foot again and placed it on the second step. "Claire," he called, not looking back, "tell me about when you helped other kids walk again. Tell me a story while I do this." Claire understood immediately what he needed. Distraction from the physical effort, something to focus his mind beyond the trembling muscles and the fear of falling. She stepped closer, staying just behind him, ready to catch him if necessary, but honoring his need to do this himself. "I once worked with a girl in London," she began, keeping her voice steady and calm. Emma was 12, a dancer who'd been in a car accident. The doctors said she might never dance again, but she refused to believe them. Caleb took another step, his breathing labored but controlled. Every day Emma would ask me to play the music from Swan Lake while she practiced standing, just standing at first for seconds at a time. She said the music helped her remember what it felt like to move freely. Another step. Alexander moved to the other side of the staircase, matching Caleb's slow ascent, not interfering but present, supportive. 3 months later, Emma stood on stage at her ballet, school's recital, not dancing the lead like before, but standing tall, moving with purpose, showing the world that bodies can heal in their own time, in their own way. 4 steps. 5. 6. Halfway up the staircase now, Caleb paused, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air from the storm. "Did she ever dance fully again?" he asked, voice strained. Claire moved up to stand just below him. "Not the way she did before," she answered truthfully. "But she found a new way to dance that was entirely her own. Sometimes healing doesn't return us to who we were, it reveals who we can become." Caleb nodded, absorbing this. Then, with renewed determination, he continued upward. Each step was a battle, but he fought with increasing confidence. When he finally reached the top of the staircase, he stood for a moment, swaying slightly, then turned to face them both. Alexander, who had paced him from the other handrail, and Claire, who had followed closely behind. "I did it," he said simply, his face transformed by an expression neither of them had seen before, pure, uncomplicated pride. Alexander's composure finally broke. He climbed the last steps between them and gently, carefully pulled Caleb into an embrace. "You did it," he echoed, his voice thick with emotion. "You absolutely did." Claire remained a few steps below, witnessing this moment of connection between father and son, with a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal joy. This was why she had become a rehabilitation specialist years ago, to see moments like this, when a patient reclaimed something they thought was lost forever. But there was something else too, something she hadn't anticipated, the realization that her role in this household was shifting in ways that both exhilarated and frightened her. She had come to care deeply for both Caleb and Alexander, not just as patients or employers, but as people who had somehow become important to her own healing. The thought was interrupted by Caleb's voice. "I still need to check on the package," he reminded them. still held in his father's careful embrace, but looking toward his bedroom door. "I think you've accomplished quite enough for one evening," Alexander said, the pride in his voice unmistakable. "Let me help you to your room and we'll check together." Claire watched as Alexander supported Caleb down the hallway, the boy taking small, unsteady steps, but undeniably walking under his own power. She followed at a distance, giving them space for this momentous journey while staying close enough to assist if needed. In Caleb's room, they found the windows secure and the package, carefully wrapped and addressed to Catherine Hamilton in Melbourne, safely dry on his desk. Alexander helped Caleb sit on the edge of his bed, both of them slightly breathless from the effort but beaming with shared accomplishment. "I think," Alexander said, looking from the package to his son, "that we should deliver this in person." Caleb's eyes widened. "You mean go to Melbourne? To see Mum?" Alexander nodded, his decision clearly just made but firm nonetheless. "After what you've accomplished tonight, she should hear about it directly from us. If," he added carefully, "that's what you want." Caleb's response was a smile so radiant it seemed to illuminate the storm-darkened room. More than anything, Claire, standing in the doorway, felt both happiness for them and a strange hollowness in her chest. This was the goal, after all, to help Caleb reconnect with his body, his father, and eventually his mother. That it was, happening faster and more dramatically than any of them had anticipated, was cause for celebration, not this unsettled feeling she couldn't quite name. Alexander turned to her, still holding Caleb's hand. "Claire, would you come with us? To Melbourne? Caleb will need your support to continue his progress, and you—" He hesitated, something complicated passing across his face. "You've become important to both of us. This journey should include you." The invitation caught her off guard. She began, then faltered, unprepared for the surge of emotion his words provoked. "I'd be honored," she finally managed, "if you're both sure that's what you want." "It is," Caleb said with certainty, reaching for her hand to pull her fully into the room, into their circle. "You helped me find my way back to walking. I want you to be there when I walk to Mum for the first time." The storm continued to rage outside, but within the walls of the Hamilton house, something had shifted irrevocably. As the three of them sat together in the lantern light, planning their journey to Melbourne, Claire allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been keeping at bay for weeks, that in helping Caleb and Alexander heal their fractured family, she had begun to heal parts of herself she'd thought permanently broken, and perhaps, just perhaps, there was room in this unfolding story for her own second chances as well. The morning of their journey to Melbourne dawned clear and brilliant, as if the storm had washed the world clean for this momentous day. The damage to the Hamilton estate had been minimal. A fallen eucalyptus that had narrowly missed the main power lines, some scattered debris across the manicured lawns, but the internal landscape of the household had been permanently altered. In the 3 days since Caleb's triumphant climb up the staircase, his progress had been remarkable. Dr. Jensen, initially skeptical of Claire's unorthodox approaches, now watched in amazement as Caleb walked short distances with only the support of a cane, his gait uneven but steadily improving. "I've never seen recovery like this in a conversion disorder case," he admitted to Alexander, as they observed Caleb practicing in the garden. "It's as if, once the psychological barrier broke, his body remembered everything it had always been capable of." "It wasn't just the psychological barrier," Alexander replied, his gaze shifting briefly to where Claire stood with Caleb, gently correcting his posture. "It was the walls I built around him, around both of us, after the accident. Claire helped us see that healing couldn't happen in isolation. Now, as their driver loaded the last of their luggage into the car that would take them to the airport, Claire found herself experiencing an unexpected case of nerves. She had spent her career helping families navigate emotional reunions after injury or illness, but this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just the professional facilitator. She was personally invested in a way that both enriched and complicated her role. "Ready?" Alexander asked, joining her on the veranda while Caleb finished his physical therapy exercises. Inside, Claire nodded, though ready seemed an inadequate word for the emotional complexity of the day ahead. "Have you spoken with Catherine? Does she know we're coming?" "I called yesterday," Alexander confirmed, his expression thoughtful. "She was surprised, to say the least. I didn't tell her about Caleb walking. Some things should be seen to be believed. How did she sound? Claire couldn't help asking. Alexander considered this. Cautious, hopeful, afraid. He smiled slightly. Rather like all of us, I suppose. Before Claire could respond, Caleb appeared in the doorway, walking carefully with his cane but with increasing confidence. He wore new clothes for the journey, not the austere, adult-like outfits that had been his uniform in the Hamilton household, but jeans and a bright blue sweater that made him look like the 9-year-old boy he was. "I'm ready," he announced, his eyes bright with anticipation. "I've been practicing what I'll say to Mom when I see her." "Oh?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "And what have you decided?" Caleb's smile was shy but determined. "That's between me and Mom. You'll have to wait and see." The flight to Melbourne passed in a blur of excitement and last-minute coaching from Claire on managing fatigue. Caleb, who had rarely left the estate in 5 years, pressed his face against the window as Sydney receded beneath them, peppering his father with questions about airplanes, clouds, and the geography visible below. Alexander answered each question with a patience Claire would have found unimaginable when she first arrived at the Hamilton household. The brittle, controlling businessman had been replaced by a father who was present, engaged, and clearly relishing his son's renewed curiosity about the world. Catherine Hamilton lived in a modest Victorian terrace in Melbourne's inner suburbs, its small front garden bright with native Australian wildflowers. As their car pulled up to the curb, Claire felt Caleb tense beside her in the back seat. "What if she doesn't want to see us after all?" he whispered, sudden doubt clouding his excitement. "What if she's built a new life without any room for me?" Claire turned to face him fully. "Caleb, do you remember what your mother wrote in her letters about playing her violin and imagining you could hear it?" He nodded, clutching his cane tighter. "Those aren't the words of someone who's forgotten or moved on," Claire said gently. "Those are the words of someone who's been waiting, hoping for exactly this moment." Alexander, who had gone very still in the front seat, added quietly, "Your mother never stopped loving you, Caleb. The package we're delivering isn't just recordings and letters. It's a chance for all of us to start again." Caleb took a deep breath, then nodded with renewed determination. "I want to walk to the door by myself." The journey from car to front door was perhaps 15 meters, but it might as well have been a marathon for what it represented. Claire and Alexander hung back, allowing Caleb to set his own pace, watching as he navigated the short garden path with careful, deliberate steps. When he reached the door, he looked back to them once, seeking reassurance, receiving encouraging nods, before lifting his hand to knock. The woman who answered was immediately recognizable from the photographs. The same sensitive eyes as Caleb, the same delicate features, though her once long dark hair was now cut in a stylish bob, streaked with premature silver. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a loose linen shirt, but held herself with the natural grace of a performer. For one frozen moment, Catherine stared at Caleb standing before her, leaning on his cane but unmistakably upright, unmistakably walking. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Hello, Mom," Caleb said, his voice small but steady. "I learned to play your violin, and I learned to walk again, too." Catherine made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, dropping to her knees to be at eye level with her son. "Caleb," she whispered, reaching out with trembling hands but stopping just short of touching him, as if afraid he might disappear. "My beautiful boy." "I got all your letters," Caleb continued, taking one small step closer to her. "And I understand why you left. I'm not angry anymore." That simple statement, the extraordinary compassion of a child who had found his way to forgiveness, broke whatever last hesitation remained between them. Catherine gathered Caleb into her arms, holding him as if she would never let go again, her tears flowing freely now. "I've missed you every day," she whispered against his hair, "every single day." Only then did she look up and notice Alexander and Claire standing a respectful distance away. Her eyes met Alexander's across the garden, decades of unspoken regrets and apologies passing between them in a single glance. "You brought him to me," she said, her voice wondering. "After everything, you brought him to me." Alexander moved forward slowly, his usual confidence tempered by the weight of the moment. He brought himself, really, with Claire's help. He nodded toward Claire, who remained where she was, feeling suddenly like an intruder in this intensely personal reunion. Catherine gently released Caleb, keeping one arm around his shoulders as she stood. "Please," she said, looking at both Alexander and Claire. "Come inside, all of you." The interior of Catherine's home revealed the life she had built in the years since leaving Sydney. Modest but warm, with music stands and instruments in one corner of the living room, student artwork on the walls, and photographs of Caleb prominently displayed on every available surface. She had never stopped being his mother, even from a distance. The hours that followed were filled with conversations both painful and healing. Catherine explained her descent into debilitating anxiety after the accident, her fear that her presence in Caleb's life was dangerous rather than nurturing. Alexander acknowledged his own failure to recognize her suffering, his retreat into controlling every aspect of Caleb's environment rather than addressing the emotional wounds they all carried. And Caleb, with wisdom beyond his years, listened to them both, occasionally adding his own perspective with a clarity that brought tears to Claire's eyes. Throughout it all, Claire remained slightly apart, offering support when needed, but increasingly aware that her role was changing, diminishing, as the family found its way back to each other. It was as it should be, her professional success defined by her own obsolescence, but the realization carried an unexpected ache. As afternoon faded into evening, Catherine invited them to stay for dinner. While she and Alexander prepared the meal, falling into a cautious but genuine rapport, Claire found herself alone with Caleb in the living room, examining the photographs that tracked his early childhood. "You look sad," Caleb observed, perceptive as always. Claire smiled, shaking her head. "Not sad, thoughtful. It's been a big day for all of you." "For you too," Caleb insisted, leaning his cane against the sofa as he carefully lowered himself to sit beside her. "You're part of this. You made it happen." "I helped," Claire corrected gently. "But this journey was always about you finding your way back, to walking, to your father, to your mother. My job was just to create the space where that could happen." Caleb considered this, his brow furrowing in the way it did when he was working through a complex idea. "But what about your journey? Dad told me you came to Australia for a fresh start, just like we're getting now. Don't you deserve that too?" The question, so innocent, yet so penetrating, caught Claire off guard. Before she could formulate a response, Alexander appeared in the doorway, his expression softening as he looked at them. "Dinner's almost ready," he said. "Catherine's made her famous lasagna. Apparently it's a hit with her students." As they moved to the dining room, Claire found herself seated between Caleb and Alexander, directly across from Catherine. The table was beautifully set, candles casting a warm glow over the four of them as they shared their first meal together. Midway through dinner, Catherine set down her fork and looked directly at Claire. "Alexander told me what you've done for Caleb, for both of them really. I can't begin to thank you enough." Claire shook her head. "There's no need for thanks. Seeing Caleb walk again, seeing all of you reconnect, that's more than enough reward." "Still," Catherine persisted, "I'd like to know more about you. Alexander mentioned you were a rehabilitation specialist in London before coming to Australia. What brought you here?" The question was asked with genuine interest rather than mere politeness, but Claire felt the familiar tightness in her chest. She glanced at Alexander, who was watching her with quiet understanding, and at Caleb, whose face showed nothing but open curiosity. Perhaps it was the profound honesty that had filled this day, or perhaps it was simply time. But Claire found herself wanting to answer truthfully for once. "I came to Australia running from my own accident," she said quietly. "I was working with a young patient in London, a boy about Caleb's age. He had been making remarkable progress after a spinal injury, just like Caleb has, but during one of our therapy sessions he fell. The damage was significant, permanent." She paused, feeling Alexander's hand come to rest gently on her arm, support freely offered with no expectation attached. "It wasn't your fault," he said softly. "I'm sure of it." Claire smiled sadly. That's what the inquiry found too. But knowing that intellectually didn't change how I felt. I couldn't face another child, another family, knowing what might go wrong despite my best intentions. So I came here, took jobs that kept me at a safe distance from the work I loved but feared. "Until us," Caleb added, his perception acute as always. "Until you," Claire agreed. "You reminded me why I became a therapist in the first place, and watching you take those steps up the staircase." She shook her head, emotion making further words difficult. Catherine reached across the table, taking Claire's free hand in hers. Then it seems we all have something to thank each other for. New beginnings come in unexpected ways, don't they? The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but something had changed in the atmosphere. A final wall coming down, a circle completed. As the evening wound to a close, plans were made for the days ahead. Caleb would stay with Catherine for a week, while Alexander returned briefly to Sydney to handle business matters. Claire would remain in Melbourne to continue Caleb's therapy and help navigate this delicate reunification. When it was time for Alexander and Claire to leave for their hotel, Caleb hugged them both fiercely at the door. "We're still a team, right?" he asked, looking between them. "Even with Mom back?" "Always," Alexander assured him, ruffling his son's hair with newfound ease. "Some teams just get bigger as they go along." Outside in the gentle Melbourne evening, Alexander and Claire walked slowly toward the waiting car, neither speaking until they were halfway down the garden path. "You could have told me," Alexander said finally. "About London, about what happened." Claire looked up at the emerging stars, so different from the northern constellations she had grown up with. "I could have," she acknowledged, "but then I would have been Claire Bennett, the therapist with a tragic past. Not just Claire Bennett, the person you and Caleb were learning to trust." "And now?" Alexander asked, stopping to face her fully. "Who are you now, Claire Bennett?" She considered the question, feeling the weight of the past lifting, slightly for the first time in years. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she admitted, "but I think I'm ready to find out." Alexander's smile held a warmth that had nothing to do with professional appreciation. "I was hoping you might say that, because while Caleb and Catherine have a lot of catching up to do, I find myself with some unexpected free time in Melbourne. I thought perhaps you might show me the city, as someone who came here looking for a fresh start." "I'd like that," Claire replied, surprised by the simplicity of her answer and the rightness of it. As they continued toward the car, Claire glanced back at Catherine's house, where lights glowed in windows and two silhouettes, mother and son, could be seen moving together in gentle harmony. The journey that had brought them all to this moment had been circuitous and painful, filled with missteps and long silences. But standing here now on the threshold of possibilities none of them had imagined just months ago, Claire knew with certainty that some journeys, no matter how difficult, were worth every step. The future for Caleb, for Alexander, for Catherine, and perhaps even for herself, stretched before them now, not as a predetermined path, but as an open road with countless directions to explore. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire Bennett was eager to see where it might lead.